Hello, I am Nicole Piemonte. I am one of the assistant deans at the Creighton University School of Medicine down in the Phoenix Regional Campus. And today I want to talk to you a bit about writing effective evaluations. So some of you may have seen Dr. P.J. Malin's excellent grand rounds on giving effective feedback. And I want to kind of harken back to a bit of what she has said in her grand rounds because I think giving quality feedback is in a lot of ways related to writing effective evaluations. Some of the core principles that guide giving quality feedback also ring true when it comes to writing an evaluation for a learner who's been on your service. So it's important to distinguish the difference between feedback and evaluation. I think sometimes we conflate the two and we don't take some time to kind of sit down and recognize what is the difference between feedback and evaluation, but there are some real distinguishing features of the two. So feedback is usually immediate. It happens right after you see a learner engage in some kind of behavior. It's often informal, while you can sometimes have a learner come into your office and sit down and get some feedback. For the most part, it's happening informally and it's happening all of the time. It's usually about specific observable behavior that you just saw. It's focused on improvement, and in that way, it's formative. It's helping them improve along the way as they're on your service. Evaluations, on the other hand, are oftentimes scheduled. They're usually formal and are happening at the end of a rotation and being submitted in a way that is associated with their grade for their overall performance, their global performance on your service. So for that reason, they're often summative and come at the very end of an experience. What's important to realize here is that feedback is different in that it's more like coaching. Rather than giving someone a final assessment, you're giving them feedback all the time, and it's informal. So it's very possible that you are doing this constantly with your learners and they don't recognize it as such. So sometimes we'll have a learner come off of a service and say, hey, I got no feedback on that rotation, when really you were giving them feedback. You were coaching them the whole time. So sometimes it's helpful to say, hey, can I give you some feedback on that? Because then you can attune your learner to the fact that they are in fact getting feedback while they're on service with you. So many of us have heard of the famous feedback sandwich. The idea that you can kind of sneak in some negative feedback or critical feedback sandwiched in between two positive statements, and that it will be less abrasive if you could sandwich it right in the middle. But really, this is how the feedback sandwich works. So here we see, I like your hat, your face is ugly, but your top is nice. I can assure you, all she hears is that her face is ugly. So simply sandwiching this kind of feedback between two positive statements does not work. And there are better ways of giving effective feedback. So the first and foremost thing to remember is that feedback needs to come from a credible source. Your learner needs to believe that they are getting feedback from someone who knows them, understands them, and has their best interest in mind. If they don't see you as credible, they see you as not knowing what you're talking about or not caring about them as a learner, they could just dismiss your feedback entirely. So there are ways of becoming a credible source in the eyes of learners. So credible sources try to understand why people do what they do. So rather than making assumptions about people's behavior, they try to understand why that person chose to do what they did. So they do this by inquiring about other people's frames. So what is a frame? We all have frameworks, if you will. So frameworks about how we see the world, how we perceive it, how we interpret it. And my frame, the way I interpret a situation, may be totally different from your frame and the way that you interpret a situation. So it's really important before we give feedback to understand the framework in which one of your learners might be operating. So how do you do that? How do you assess another person's frame? So you want to comment on observable behavior first. So Dr. Malin calls this firsthand data that you need to comment on behavior that you see with your own eyes rather than hearsay. So, this is not observable behavior, though I hear it all the time when I see it on some of my students' evaluations or when they come back and say, they told me to be more engaged or take more initiative, but I don't really know what that means. I don't know how to be more engaged. I felt like I was engaged. I felt like I took initiative, right? So, this is not observable behavior, but rather an assumption about who someone is. They're a disengaged person who lacks initiative. So instead, you got to comment on observable behavior. So, for example, a physician might say, I asked you this morning to have the drain removed from Mrs. Hodges. Why does she still have it? Okay. So there's a temptation here. There's a temptation on the part of the attending to be like, wow, this person doesn't take initiative or doesn't listen. Why would they not do something when I asked them 6 hours ago to get it done? So some of those temptations are really reasonable. But what we got to do here is pause, take a step back, and check the learner's frame. So it's relatively easy to do that. You just ask, why didn't that happen? Why didn't the drain get removed? Why is it still there? So it's I noticed that this happened. Why is that so? So you could get some varied responses to this question. You may get a response from, let's say it's a resident. Well, I'm not in a rush. I didn't feel like doing it yet. If that's the response you get from your resident, then maybe that temptation you had to make all those assumptions was a really reasonable temptation, and those were accurate assumptions. We hope it's not the case, but you might get a response that confirms all those things. But you know what? At least you checked. You checked the frame, you were right. They've got some problems. You guys need to have a sit-down, formal feedback. Or you might get the response that's more along the lines of, oh no, I'm so sorry. I got busy and totally forgot. I'll take care of it right now. Now, this is a little better. We all have gotten busy and forgotten to do things. And so this could be a reasonable explanation. And then you could talk to this resident about the importance of writing things down and prioritizing. But this could be a little bit more of a reasonable explanation. Or you might get this response. Oh, Dr. Green texted me asking if I'd go down to the ED to see a new admit since I've seen her before in clinic. I spent a lot of time talking to her and her family about what was going on because they were really freaked out and it put me behind. I'm really sorry. I'll take care of Mrs. Hodges right now. So, while you might still have some suggestions for ways that this resident could have done something better, you do see that maybe those assumptions were inaccurate. This is a hard worker who does listen and who was just spending good time with a patient and family who really needed it in the ED. So it's good that you checked the frame here and tried to understand why the task you asked to be done was in fact not completed. So really, assessing others' frames is just simply defaulting to giving people the benefit of the doubt. Defaulting to, okay, maybe there's a reasonable explanation here, so I'm going to ask about it first. I'm going to check their frame. So some of these principles that we've just been talking about in terms of giving feedback also apply to writing quality evaluations. So evaluations, which remember are summative, often used as a grade, they're a global assessment, come at the end of a rotation, something that you write into new innovations or MedHub, right? They also use descriptive language about observable events, about things that you witnessed with your own eyes, rather than assumptions about a learner's motives. So these evaluations, just like feedback, focus on specific behavior, what you actually saw them do or not do, and what they should be doing differently. And finally, written evaluations offer actionable suggestions for ways that a learner can improve, specific suggestions for things that they might do differently moving forward. So let's practice a bit. So Here are some real evaluations written for residents several years back who are no longer at our hospitals, and actually written by faculty who are no longer with us either. So I was able to pull some old evaluations that I think are representative of the evaluations that I still see kind of over and over again. And we can see which might be better or worse given some of the principles that we just talked about. So for this poor resident number 1, here is their first evaluation from an attending. Spend more time reading. So I see this a lot. And while it might be true that this resident does need to spend more time studying or reading up on his or her patients, when we just see spend more time reading, it begs a question of spend more time reading what? And so it's really important that if you feel compelled to tell your learner they need to spend more time reading, offer some suggestions of what they should be reading. A second attending says, he's doing well. The only complaint, takes too long to see patients. The patients felt that they were at the clinic too long. Okay, so this is a little better, but it's unclear whether this attending saw with his or her own eyes that this resident takes too long with patients, or this is just maybe what he or she has heard about this resident. And this doesn't really give any specific information of how this resident could improve. How does a resident better agenda set in the clinic? How do they prioritize? And how do they become more efficient with their patient encounters? This is just kind of a vague statement that they take far too long in the clinic and make patients wait too long. Finally, a third attending says, completes thorough H&Ps, but daily soap notes sometimes miss certain elements, likely due to time crunch. He keeps in touch with his ancillary staff and his patients to ensure good care and follow-up. His bedside manner was noted by numerous patients who had many compliments. He will need to continue working on his organization skills if he wants to keep up with the winter workload, but I believe he's capable and will perform when needed if he doesn't hesitate to request help. So we've got much more detail here, right? And this resident might see that his H&Ps are good, but the soap notes are lacking in some ways because he's rushing. Some positive statements here about keeping in touch with the staff and taking good care of his patients, and some suggestions about working on his organization skills to keep up with the winter workload. Now, we might want some more specific suggestions of how to be more organized, but at least we do have some actionable suggestions to reach out and ask for help when he needs it. So let's look at resident number 2. The first attending for resident number 2 says, needs to care more about his work and be more responsible towards his patients. All right, so this is not about observable behavior. This is really about an assumption about this resident not caring about his work and being irresponsible. So I could see this resident dismissing this feedback as not coming from a credible source. I could see this resident saying that attending is judgmental and just thinks I don't care, but obviously I care. Why would I be here? And of course I'm responsible. I do all this work. So this would probably not go over well on an evaluation. A second attending said, eager to learn, will do well. So this is equally as vague, at least it's positive, but this would probably be very confusing to the resident who had one attending who says that they don't care and they're not responsible, another attending who says I'm eager to learn and will do well, may have difficulty reconciling those two very disparate comments. Then we have a third attending who says, his ability to complete H&Ps and soap notes in a timely manner has improved greatly since the beginning of the year. He always knows his patients well and can recall in detail their history, physical, and plan to date. I've noticed that in an effort to get his notes completed faster, sometimes they will lack details in the A&P that we've just discussed when reviewing the patient. He needs to continue to work on his timing while not losing the great attention to detail that he normally provides. So this one is much more helpful. We've got some constructive and specific observable behavior here about completing the soap notes on time. And there is some constructive feedback about this effort to get notes completed faster, so being in too much of a rush. this resident might overlook some details. So this resident might read this and say, okay, I need to be more detailed, to spend a little bit more time on my notes to perform better on this rotation. And then finally, we've got a fourth attending who says, needs to work much harder, unable to complete tasks on time, not reliable with tasks, needs more work ethic. All right, so potentially we've got some observable behavior. Maybe they could give examples of which tasks were not completed on time, or why they think that this person's not reliable with tasks. But this needs more work ethic really is an assumption about this person's character rather than observable behavior. And because that kind of sharp critique about who a person is at their core, the resident might get a little bit defensive with this and dismiss this feedback as not credible. And so even if this resident needs to hear this, they're not going to hear it, given that there are not comments about observable behavior and there's not an assumption of virtue on the part of the attending. So finally, we've got anonymous resident number 3. So we've got one attending who says to anonymous resident number 3, needs to work on learning the system. Now, learning the system is a very vague and also a tall order. So if this person is asking this resident to learn the entirety of the healthcare system, that might be a little bit much to ask for this resident. So maybe being specific about which system the resident needs to learn more about, offering some observations about what the resident doesn't know and needs to know. Is it related to the EHR, the call structure? Give some examples of how this person might be able to function better within the system. Then we've got spend more time reading. There it is again. As I told you, I see this over and over again in evaluations. So if you feel compelled to ask your resident or your student to spend more time reading, suggest what readings they might spend more time engaging in. And finally, we've got great intern. Strengths are his medical knowledge, professional attitude, pleasant demeanor, prompt completion of clinical tasks and responsibility. Definitely someone whose history and physicals are above and beyond his peers. Overall, great to work with him. Areas for improvement would be on overcoming his shy demeanor. It's important for him to be able to effectively communicate ideas and tasks and feedback to his interns. So I like this one in that it's specific. It's positive, but also offers some critical feedback in this evaluation. One thing I might suggest is overcoming one's shy demeanor is also a tall order, kind of like learning the system. This resident may or may not know that he is shy, but asking him to overcome that shy demeanor could be a little bit difficult. So offering some suggestions, maybe asking him to ask more open-ended questions with his patients, or engaging more with the team, asking for help when he needs it, to offer help to others if they might need it, could be helpful here. So some very specific, actionable suggestions would be really helpful for this resident in this evaluation. So some take-home points for what we've been talking about today. Think of feedback as coaching. Don't think of it as a daunting, scary thing that you need to pull someone into your office and have a big sit-down session for feedback. You can see it as coaching happening in the moment. Do be aware of who's around who might be able to hear that feedback if you're giving critical feedback. If you're giving positive feedback, it might be good that the rest of the team hears it. But if you're giving critical feedback, be aware of that. But do know that feedback should be timely and happening in the moment. Both feedback and evaluation should be specific. They need to be about observable behavior that you witness with your own eyes and not about assumptions about someone's character. This is because people need to see you as credible. So check for frames. Check to understand why your learners do what they do without making assumptions. When you do that, they will hear your feedback. They will read that evaluation and take it to heart when they believe that you are a credible source. And always try to give your learners the benefit of the doubt. We all want the benefit of the doubt. We all want others to not make assumptions about why we do what we do. So just taking a moment to pause before you give feedback, Take a breath before you write an evaluation and try to give your learner the benefit of the doubt so that they can hear that feedback and make positive changes in the future. So I wish you well in your efforts to give good feedback and to write quality evaluations. And just know that we are so grateful for all of the work that you are doing with our residents and our students here at Creighton.